Hello,
conference.
Ethan. Hi, Ethan. You sent me a
Hello.
topic to look at today, which is the BIM Execution Plan. I don't understand it that well. Maybe you can explain it to me. I've had a quick read through, but I'd love to hear your explanation.
Okay. BIM Execution Plan is the documents which explain about how to utilize BIM to achieve the objectives between all the parties in the within the project. What it was recommended to do as a when we do as a special condition of contracts, when we sign a project or when we initiate the projects, and then we will start as a BEP is part of the special conditions of contracts, and it comes together with the contracts come together with BIM execution plan. So and New Zealand has NZBIM and NZBIM. The organization's name is NZ, and it's recommended documents called BEP. Every country has different BEP. Singapore has it, European Union has it, and UK has it. So it's their own interpretations of BEP. So the purpose is to make sure all the stakeholders aligned the deliverables and the modeling standards and the exchange data along the way for the whole projects. And also what important is who do what. So clarify all the roles when you look at BEP and which organizations will provide what kind of informations and responsibility and the procedure and what kind of details will be included. So last week we discussed about LOD, what kind of which stage of the project, what kind of level of development, level of details will be included, that will be discussed, that will be record in BEP. And there's when you look at New Zealand BEP, BIM Execution Plan, you can see that matrix as well. And I think we will put it the link in the footnote of this podcast. And what another thing is when a few, let's say that the mother, to me, the mother of BEP is BSPA, British Standards Institute PAS 1992. So what that was, maybe there was some BEP earlier than that, but New Zealand BEP was based on PAS 1992. And when I was in the uni, when I was studying for master degree, and I studied PAS 1192, sorry, PAS 1192, and there are quite similarity as well. There are when you look at it, you can see how these things works together and implementation. There are some flaws. I don't want to say it's flaws as well because actual implementations of BIM would be quite complicated because BEP is only about how they want to execute, but actual executions and management would be even deeper than that, like what I mentioned earlier, how you want to do the data exchange. What will be the model standards? So it's just BEP is only the outline of, okay, when we do this, organizations will do this kind of model standard. For example, like which software you want to use, what kind of data exchange you want to use, and what kind of procedures you want to use. But BEP doesn't go into too details. So it's just talk about how they want to execute and roles and responsibility and the matrix only. But BEP, as I mentioned, it can be a contractual document, which is part of the special condition of contract, and it goes with and the project. It will go along with the projects.
I was just having a look at an example BIM execution plan. It's one
Yeah,
of the ones you sent me the link for. And it's got things like schedule of information exchange,
yeah,
or so design authoring, who's what discipline, all disciplines. But it doesn't
yeah.
tell you much about what disciplines are involved in or who's coming from there. So to me, some of this BIM execution plan is giving you some information, but not giving you information that's specific enough. So, for example, if we go back up on this BIM execution plan, it's got the BIM use, design authoring, value to the project, it's really high value, who are the responsible parties, the architect, the structural engineer, the MEP, and the fire. Geotech's not there. These days, surely a geotech engineer is also part of that design authoring, particularly in terms of dealing with the structural requirements.
It's a high-level document, but when you talk about, maybe next week we will talk about what's the standard we just discussed.
There was something that you and I think need to talk about, and that is later on in this. So let me just finish what I was saying here. That
Mhm.
I think that this is a bunch of paper for the point of having a bunch of paper, and it doesn't tell you enough. And then later on, it's got model standards, and then it says the company name, XYZ guide, and standards. And my first thought is that you shouldn't be using a company specific model standards. You should be using an international model standards. And I think we need to talk about that next week because there's a couple of great model
Yeah,
standards that could be used, but they do sound very complicated.
you can define what kind of model standards or what kind of company or what kind of IFC, because BEP for New Zealand standards, you can download and you can customize it. It's like instead of 3910, you can fill it with blank. Yeah,
But if
you
you
can do that.
customize it and then
Mhm.
in 5 years' time you give your model to somebody else, you then have to have a document that tells them what those model standards are. So, just to finish off why we need model standards, it's important so that everybody is using the same layer slash class names and drawing titles and drawing numbers so that everybody knows what is expected in terms of that standard. In the old days, we used to call it a CAD manual or a CAD standard. I used to write
Yeah,
them for the company I worked for in London. And so it should really go down to the level of telling people when they create a library object what that how that should be named and how that should be have layers or visibility opportunities built into that. I think there's a whole discussion about model standards later. We should have that. Maybe we should bring that in next week.
yeah,
But my point about using company specific model standards is BIM is supposed to be open. We're supposed to be using an open BIM system. That if we give this to the client and the client then says in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, oh, I need somebody to build onto this, then need to be using a layer naming system or a model standard system so that the people that get that, it may not be the company that it starts with. So I think we need to be looking at a more international standard. But my worry about the BIM execution plan is that it says a lot of stuff, but doesn't say a lot of stuff.
yeah. I'm also want to comment about that also, because that's the reason of we are reviewing this podcast. When we look at BIM execution plan, like last week we discussed about that also. For example, it doesn't go into so much details about that. It's just a stretch over the surface only. For example, last week we discussed about the dough. When you make the LOD for the dough, and what about ironmongery? Will it be separated, or how will it be working together? All these things. So it's just which organizations will do. It only mentions that these organizations will be design author. When you look at BEP, this organization will be the design author, and they will do the modeling. It's not. It doesn't go into that details. And it's okay. There are one point it says that okay, for this kind of design stage, you need to provide LOD 500, LOD 350, but what is LOD? The definitions of LOD 500, LOD 350 are not clear because it should be more exhaustive. That's my point of view. That's my opinion. Yeah, what you mentioned is for the document sake of the document, but it's what part of it can be part of the contractual document, but it should be more fine tuning for actual implementations. That's what I think.
There's a requirement in here after model standards to have a model structure and a model description document, an MDD. So the model description document, it sounds like that's the one that's going to define what the levels of development are so
Yes,
that everybody
yes.
is clear in that. But it does sound like a lot of paperwork.
Yes, a lot of paperwork, and I think there are 7 documents. When last year they invited for public opinions, and there are, I think, if I'm not wrong, there are 7 appendixes, and yeah, that's the one. 7 appendixes, and you need to fill up almost all of it. The first one is BIM execution plan, which followed by 7 appendixes, if I'm not wrong, and then another. So it's a very heavy administrative work.
Yes. All right. No one else can see what we can see on the screen. I've actually got the BIM execution plan up, and it's got a list of the project phases and the levels of development that are supposed to be applied to each one. And it seems to me that there's something wrong with these, because if we're looking at, for example, walls and fencing, at concept design, we should be looking at LOD 200, but in preliminary design, maybe LOD 200. But at developed design, we must be looking at LOD 300. And at detailed design, we should be looking at LOD 350, because we've got coordination to go with our walls, holes in the walls, windows, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I would expect this to be different. That's all.
Yeah, that's a starting point for BIM executions. You can customize, fine tune, and yeah. And also
So
it's require a lot of experience as well, not a simple one.
no, it's not simple. It's document content analysis requires a
Yeah,
huge amount of experience to know
yeah,
what to put on the documents. So if I understand this correctly, you can think of the BIM execution plan as being like a roadmap. This is where we're going, and this is how we're getting here. But
yes.
there's a lot of detail that has to be in other documents.
That's why there are seven comes together with BEP. When you go to the
Right.
website, there are links that you'll be able to download from there. But anyway, I didn't put in Evernote, but in the original website of the building government and the New Zealand BIM organizations, then you can have a download for that.
All
And
right.
I'll put it
Put
in
put
the
the link in the show notes,
yes,
Ethan. That'll help other
right.
people to see them. It sounds like we've covered this discussion.
Yes, we did. So to summarize, BEP is the high-level document, and there are a lot of details and a lot of experience you need to put it in to finish for the project success. And yeah, and we will next week. What are we going to talk about that? Yeah.
I think we should talk about model standards next week, because the BIM execution document requires someone to define the BIM standards.
Mhm.
And my argument is going to be that the standards need to be across the project. So we've got an architect, structural engineer, geotech engineer, fire engineer, we've got MEP engineers. We're going to be sharing a lot of information back and forth, and they need to agree, and the architect needs to agree on a system which is able to withstand all of those professions. And maybe it needs to be one that's an international recognized system. So we're going to have a look at a couple of systems that we've used in the past. We've got things like master spec, and where are we going in the future? We'll have a look at that. Don't forget to subscribe on Spotify, and you'll get notified every time we've uploaded a new podcast. So Ethan, thank you much for your time.
Thank you, and see you next week.